I want to begin by asking you your earliest reaction to the novel or its awareness in your life.
Yeah, so when I read the novel, it's very different from the novel. I think in the end, the film, it's not a queer story in any way, the novel, but this idea of being able to go back into your past to meet your parents again, have a kind of reunion with that past was so fascinating, I think, to me. And that was the thing that really struck me as such an interesting, core idea. And then especially to take that from a queer perspective and add that element to the story about what that means to go back to a past, to go back to a time where you felt very uncomfortable with your sexuality. It was a very difficult time, I guess, in the 80s for a lot of people, and it was for Adam, the character. And then it was combining all kind of those things together, and queerness in relationship to family and loss and grief, and I kind of took it from there.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I want to talk about the grief aspect of it a little bit. To me, I mean, watching this, it feels very close because of the pandemic and isolation, and also personal grief and collective grief that came out of that. Would you touch on that aspect of the film?
Yeah, look, I think everybody has experienced grief, or is ready to experience grief, or is prepared to grieve. Our whole life is based around people coming into our lives and people leaving our lives. And I don't even mean necessarily in terms of death either.
Yeah.
I think we have so many relationships that just we lose, and then you don't see them again for 20, 30 years, perhaps ever. So I think grief is part of our lives. And I think during the pandemic, we became very aware of it. A lot of people were dying, and there was a lot of fear, again, about would we lose loved ones. So I think even though it's not about the pandemic, obviously, the film, I wrote it during that period of time. So I think it's infiltrated the tone, perhaps, of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wonder, would you talk a little bit about creating this really beautiful intimacy on set? It must have been because of the characters, Adam and Harry. There's this very lovely, abiding relationship that is very sexual, but also just gentle and loving. Would you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, look, it's so important to me. I'm trying to express the feeling of intimacy or growing intimacy, or what it feels like to fall in love, or what it feels like for him to be with his parents again. So it's about harnessing a sense of intimacy on set. So, you do that in lots of little ways, just by the conversations you have with the actors, or the way you set up a scene, or the way you try and limit the mechanics of filmmaking. So you can try and get closer to some kind of truth, I suppose, or some kind of really intimate moment that you are then able to capture. So I spend a lot of my time doing that, and just trying to always be open to what is that moment that I see in front of me on the screen that feels like something is changing, something's being understood, two people are falling for each other, whether it's a touch of skin on someone's hand, or whether it's the sexual intimacy between them, or whether it's the Adam hugging his dad and feeling the sweatshirt that he's wearing. It's all those kind of things that become important.
Yeah. Would you talk a bit about, there's this, feels like a juxtaposition to me of the building where Adam lives, which is so vacant and towering and kind of sad in its way, and then your childhood home as where mom and dad live. Would you talk about the difference in those places?
Yeah, and it actually was in the original novel. There was a sense of a childhood home being this kind of warmer place, and then his present day he was in a tower block too, and I just wanted to keep that. I love that idea that he's just not been able to move on, or he thinks he's moved on. I think that's the thing. He's relatively successful, Adam, in the story. He lives in a nice flat, and he lives sort of in London, and everything should be okay, but there was a core loneliness that he hasn't been able to shed or get rid of. And to me, the film has always been about someone trying to find a way to escape loneliness. It's not sinking into loneliness, it's trying to escape from it. So he's longing for understanding, connection throughout the film. Yeah,
and I want to talk a little bit about these conversations that you wrote into the film about generational queerness, which are very real. And I mean, for one thing, the conversation about gay versus queer. We have those all the time at the Advocate. So would you touch on including that specific couple of lines.
Yeah, I do love how things have changed. They do change,
Yeah.
you know, but I feel like it's amazing how quickly things change. Like,
Yeah.
I'm 50 now, and I feel like there's a younger generation of queer people who use different language. They feel very different about things. They've grown up
Yeah.
in a very, very different time. And sometimes there can be some conflict between those two generations. And I think I remember being young and being in my 20s and probably doing the same thing. Being like, oh, I'll disregard the generation that came before me. And I am redefining what it means to be gay at that point, as the term we used.
Right, right.
And of course, it's changed again. But I think as you get older, you realize that everybody, it's all just linked. We may change, we may have different words, and we may have different experiences. But what we share between the generations is the important thing.
Right.
And as I've got older, you sort of cherish that. You cherish your gay history. You cherish that it was different for a generation above, and they had different challenges, and sometimes very difficult challenges. And I think it's important for the whole community to realize that we've all come from somewhere in terms of how we understand our queerness in the world. So I try and be non-judgmental about, even if people are judgmental towards me sometimes, I'm like, it's okay. I can be
know.
compassionate to that. I understand that you're 22 and your opinion is very important, and I
Yes.
get that too.
Yes, that's wise.
Yeah.
Well, and then also I think it was that same conversation, maybe not, but the conversation about HIV/AIDS and fearing sex because of that. I came out in 1987, so very much in that era, and I always appreciate when people bring it up, what that was like for folks. So would you talk about including that as well?
Yeah, it's always been very important to me. I feel like people, a younger generation especially, need to understand what it was like for people to grow up in that time. Now, there was a generation of people that came into their sexuality before AIDS and then were deeply, horrendously affected by AIDS, obviously. There's a sort of middle generation of people who came into their sexuality as AIDS was already around. And I think that's the generation I'm part of.
Me as
And I
well.
feel like the fear of understanding your sexuality in the shadow of AIDS was pretty horrendous to have to deal with. And I think it's affected a lot of people going through their lives. And the amount of homophobia that was around that time and the shame that was associated with HIV and AIDS that was put on us from other people, you know, from the world at large. And I think it's been very hard for a lot of people to get over that. And I always sort of bristle at the idea that that's just a generation of self-loathing gay people. And I'm like, hold on.
Yeah.
We weren't inherently self-loathing. We had shame because it was put on us from
Yes.
other people.
Yeah.
And a lot of our journey, if you want to call it a journey, is trying to shed that from us and forget it. And I think in this film, he seems to have got over all of that feeling, but it's still all there, bubbling away inside, and it can pop up at very strange times in your life when you're like, oh, I know I'm being triggered by how I used to feel, not necessarily how I feel now, but how I used to feel. And that can be quite profound, I think, in people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I want to switch gears a little bit to the soundtrack, because there are plenty of films that use, kind of new wave music or Britpop, and but I thought you used some that were really new to this film. Alison Moyet's "Is This Love?" I think that's what you used, and the House Martins and "Fine Young Cannibals." Not the song everyone knows. So that was really put me in that place. Would you talk a little bit about the process of choosing the music?
Yeah, I love music, and I think in this it was about, like, I want to choose pop songs. Like, I feel like music in general allows you to time travel. You can listen to a song that you loved as a kid, and suddenly you feel like, oh my God, I remember being 13 years old or whatever it was, listening to the Pet Shop Boys or whatever it might be. So it's really important to me. And then I really wanted to choose songs that expressed something about the film and expressed something about me, I suppose, in the music I love. And that is what pop music can do. And look, lots of it, they're either queer bands from the 80s or queer adjacent bands, I would say.
Yeah.
Like the House Martins were very kind of socially liberal in their time and had some really fascinating things that they would sing about in the songs. And I always feel like the Fine Young Cannibals, while not a queer band, felt very adjacent to the kind of queer scene. And obviously, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Pet Shop
Yes.
Boys. We had an Erasure song in there at some point when you see the Erasure album.
Yes. That was my first Erasure album.
Oh, was it? Yeah, it was my first Erasure album too, and I loved that album so
Oh my God.
much.
Sometimes.
At one point we had The Circus in there, the song The Circus, which I always loved. It's like so melancholy and beautiful. And so I think that music, it was oddly subversive at the time as well.
Yes.
You know, this is like the early, mid-'80s, and there were a lot of these queer bands who no one sort of thought were queer. Bizarre, I mean, it's so obvious now when you look back.
Right.
But at the time, it didn't seem to be a thing. And I feel like there was more then than there is now, bizarrely.
Yeah.
There were so many, especially in the UK. And so I kind of loved the fact that I could get some of those songs in this movie.
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate that about it. Put me in that time very well. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about repetition, the repetition of the train. And I could be totally off. This is kind of an aside. I was getting small town boy vibes from the scenes on the train. Would you talk about your reasoning for that repetition in showing him on the train going back and forth?
Yeah, I really like this idea of this journey thing, and I think in some weird sense for queer people, it's always some kind of journey back into your past, or like I don't know. It felt like just right for the story. And you're right about Small Town Boy. I could never put Small Town Boy in the film as a song because it's been used so many times.
So much, yes.
But you know, I remember the video for Small Town Boy, and it's this idea of escape, and you have to run away. And there's a line in this when he talks about how he used to run away as a kid and wanted to go to London, and I feel like that's such a queer experience of just feeling like I can't be here, I can't be in my family like I am as a queer person. I need to go run away and run. But where are you running to? Is that going to be better? What does that mean? And I just love that how the train kind of felt. Also that you were somehow sort of drifting back. There's a rhythmical nature of train journey, and when you're from the suburbs, which where I was from, you spend a lot of time going on trains, and it's so much a part of like British life is just being on the trains. It just it sort of felt right.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. I want to be sure that I ask you, because I asked everyone else, but those kind of pair of scenes with Adam and Mom and Adam with Dad, where he comes out to her and her reaction is what it would have been in the 1987, and also Dad's reaction of, you know, talking about bullying and how he, I think in some ways, I guess probably wanted Adam to toughen up. Would you talk about the inclusion of those very real scenes?
And I love those scenes because what I think they do is they do two things. They are a scene between a mother and a son and a father and a son, and they're expressing things, and they're kind of honest about how they would have felt. We were very careful that like we had to play it as if they were still in 1987, and those are the reactions. And to me, it was also really important just to get across this idea that for Adam, like all of what he used to feel, all of what the world used to say about gay people, which is what the mother is talking about and what the father is talking about, that's embedded in all of us of that generation. You know, how many times did we hear, oh, but it's very lonely being gay? You know, we all heard that so many times.
Just want you to be happy.
I just want you to be happy.
Yeah, it's a hard life.
It's a hard, exactly. It's a hard life. Oh, I don't know how you're going to cope. We don't want you to live like that. And that was what we heard every single day, year upon year upon year upon year, until things finally started to change. So I think it's important that that was in the story, and that the parents in those conversations were neither fully accepting or fully kind of repugnant at the idea. You know, so I like the way that it's in some middle ground, and also to try and actually be a little bit compassionate to the parents as well. They are a product of their time. I always think it's very dangerous to, in the present moment, to look back and go, oh God, wasn't everyone awful then? And you're like, they were products of their time. You can't escape the time you live in. And opinions change and viewpoints change. And if the parents hadn't died, they would have changed their opinion too, I'm convinced, and they would have changed with it. So I think we've got to always be careful about not being furious about how people were in the past without realising that they existed within a time.